From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. I often forget that something like pollinator habitat has many other functions. Think about something like a flowering prairie. Not only does it support a number of diverse plant species that pollinators go to, but underneath the soil, there's all that root system that can also act in water filtration and holding soil and a number of other benefits. That's what my guest is going to be talking about this week, Tim Youngquist from Iowa State University. He has a lot of experience working with farmers to put in prairie strips using a science-based approach. And in this episode, he's going to give us some tips that he gives to farmers in Iowa that I think could be applicable here in the Pacific Northwest. One thing that I find really remarkable in this episode is the reliance on perennials and frequent mowing in the establishment years. So we're going to hear about how these prairie strips are established, some of the incentives that exist out there, and why I think we here in the Pacific Northwest should be thinking about prairie strips. So without further ado, let's head to Iowa to talk with Tim Youngquist this week on Pollination. All right. Well, Tim, welcome to Pollination, all the way from Iowa.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I'm really excited too. I was on the internet, and actually one of our listeners sent me the video that you're featured in talking about these prairie strips in Iowa. And maybe for those who haven't seen this video or have never heard of a prairie strip, can you describe what a prairie strip is? What does it look like? What are we talking about in terms of scale? And what would the plants that you would see if you were walking down an established strip?
Yeah, so a prairie strip is kind of what we've been calling it here at Iowa State, where the idea started for the Prairie Strips program. But really what we're talking about is just finding opportunities to get prairie back on the agricultural landscape. You know, here in Iowa, we're at the heart of what was the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. So just dead center. And what was the tallgrass prairie ecosystem? It was a mix of grasses, forbs or flowers, legumes, sedges, all different kinds of herbaceous species primarily. And that dominated in the upper Midwest for thousands of years. So what we're trying to do at Iowa State or with the Prairie Strips program is to work some of that vegetation back into the row crop landscape that we have here now in Iowa and in the upper Midwest and in places like Oregon, where it would be potentially applicable, maybe not the same species. There would have been hundreds of species of prairie plants that would have populated the remaining remnant prairies that are throughout the upper Midwest. I'm going to keep referring to Iowa and the upper Midwest because I'm a little bit of an expert here, but I am not an expert, when it comes to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
So I hope this is applicable to your listeners. But there would have been a lot of species that would have made up the original prairie. We cannot, for a variety of reasons, put all those species back into a prairie strip, but if we can try to get about the 30 or 35 species that would have made up a big chunk of the biomass of that original prairie. So I'm talking about cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and then a variety of forbs and legumes that would bloom at various points throughout the year to provide forage and nesting habitat and nectar and everything for pollinators, for wildlife, all that. So a lot of different prairie species trying to mimic that natural system without being able to put 300 or 400 species of plants in there.
That's incredible and makes a lot of sense. But I imagine the way this looks when it gets inserted into an ag landscape is not, I don't know, what you would see in a Western where you have this grassland that goes on forever. Rather, it must be fit into specific spaces around agricultural settings. Can you describe how that looks?
Yep. That's right. And I'll keep saying it again and again. You'll probably get tired of me saying it, just looking for opportunities to get habitat or to get prairie on the landscape. And what's neat about the Prairie Strips program or Prairie Strips practice is that it can be applied very flexibly. It can be applied in a lot of different ways.
Uh-huh.
One of the main ways that people can use it is around all or portions of the edge of a field. So imagine you've got a crop field or an orchard or a vegetable crop, whatever it may be, creating a picture frame around that field from
Ah.
30 to 120 feet wide is kind of the metrics that we're dealing with. Otherwise, it can be applied through the field and in fields that have a fair amount of slope. So if you can imagine over about 5% slope, if that means anything to your listeners,
Yeah.
then the strip would be on the contour. So that would mean that it basically is following the topography line, staying at the same level, and it would kind of be this delicate thing that moves through the field. And again, that would be kind of 30 to 120 feet wide. Additionally, we have a lot of tools now in precision agriculture. So being able to look at soil maps, being able to look at yield maps, being able to look at LiDAR, all this technology that we can examine what's called subfield profitability. So across the field, every acre is not going to be the same. It's not going to be equally productive. If you can target areas that are maybe
Huh.
less productive or not making money, maybe that's a triangle on the edge of the field. Maybe that's a wet spot. Maybe that's a high gravelly spot. If you can kind of just encircle that area and convert that to prairie, change that land use from something that's suboptimal for producing food or row crops or whatever it may be, and then put that in prairie, that it's really going to provide a lot of benefits to habitat, to keeping soil in place, to filtering water, all that kind of stuff. So it can really be applied around the field, through the field, or taking out chunks of the field that are maybe suboptimal for producing row crop.
That's great. I can see what you mean by flexibility. So you're really kind of like, and I love that idea of like looking at the whole farm, and you have an area that's just a little steep. You actually don't want to farm it, or you have areas that you've just been losing money on over time, and that would be a great place to sort of insert this. So you're really kind of thinking. I love this approach of using both being sensitive to sort of where a working landscape and where the where people's livelihood is being made, but also using contemporary modern technology to try to map out areas that would really hit the sweet spot. But you did also say you started to talk about the benefits of filtration, of water quality. Tell us a little bit more about the broader benefits of these strips, and tell us what do people get out of these strips? What farmers and also the community at large?
Yeah, the benefits they go to what we call disproportionate benefits, meaning that you put a small amount of the field into prairie and you can receive more in return. This Prairie Strips deal was an idea that started with a group of researchers at Iowa State University in central Iowa, kind of right in the middle of the country, back in 2004. They had an idea that they wanted to put something out into a field, and they weren't quite sure. They talked about switchgrass as maybe like a bioenergy crop, or something like smooth brome, which is from France, which is really widely used here in Iowa for waterways, road ditches, things like that. People are already familiar with. And then as the conversation went on, they realized that prairie was something that once covered 85% of the state of Iowa. And Iowa is a little bit notorious for being known as the most altered state in the nation.
Huh.
What was once 85% prairie is now 75% of the land area in Iowa are two crops, corn and soybeans.
Uh-huh.
Just a staggering change from this deep-rooted perennial system to an annual system. And again, full disclosure, I also farm corn and soybeans in Western Iowa. So this is not any kind of an indictment of farming, but just looking to see, can we do this better? Can we examine the situation? I think we have the tools now that we realize creating such a changed landscape had a lot of unintended consequences. So the Prairie Strips research team thought, hey, let's try to get some of what was formerly the dominant ground cover back onto the agricultural landscape.
Mm-hmm.
They tried to put it in a variety of different places in these small experimental watersheds in central Iowa. And they tried to put it in a variety of different places and a variety of different amounts. And essentially, through 15 years of research, we found that converting 10% of a field to prairie was kind of the magic number. If you went up to 20%, you kind of hit a point of diminishing returns. It would be more valuable for wildlife, but for water filtration and soil health, you weren't really seeing big benefits. And asking someone,
Interesting.
a farmer, to take
Huh.
out even 10% of their land, it's a big ask. So we want to be as sensitive to that as possible. But what we found was adding 10% of a field to corn, of a corn and soybean field, adding 10%, converting 10% of that field to prairie, created what we call these disproportionate benefits that I mentioned. So we saw a 37% reduction in the amount of water leaving the field over the course of the year. Now, a lot of that is going in being infiltrated. It's being absorbed by last year's existing plant material, all these things. We saw a 95% reduction in the amount of sediment that was leaving these watersheds. So not 100%, but
Wow.
again, taking 10% of a
Huh.
field out. And this is all available through scientifically peer-reviewed publications on our website, prairiestrips.org. I'm sure there'll be links to that involved with the podcast.
Yep.
But just saving a staggering amount of soil. We saw a 95%, or excuse me, a 70% reduction in the amount of phosphorus leaving the fields, and a 70% reduction in the amount of nitrogen leaving the fields. So nitrogen and phosphorus are two of
Wow.
the most commonly applied fertilizers here in Iowa. And again, this is stiff-stemmed, deep vegetation that's active all year long. It's perennial. It's going to be coming back from the roots. You're basically just creating a filter at least just at the edge of the field, where you're stopping the export of those nutrients and water out of the field. And when they leave the field, not only are you losing your soil, you're losing your infrastructure from that field, but it becomes a problem downstream for other people, for cities that are trying to create clean drinking water, all these other things. If you can just keep some of that in the field. Again, to go back to the benefits, we saw a 70% reduction in the subsurface nitrate. So these deep roots are acting like a sponge, absorbing some of that. We saw more than triple pollinator abundance and more than double bird abundance in fields with prairie strips versus without. We saw no influence on crop yield. So what we did see is that the 10% or whatever amount you converted, that part is gone. Don't mistake what I'm saying. It's a
Yeah.
proportional amount that you lose in the yield. We saw no additional weed problems. So these are perennial species. In a system where you're doing either some kind of tillage or herbicide application, it's going to be very difficult for that to migrate out into the field. The weeds that were there before the prairie strip are the weeds that were there afterwards. And then here in Iowa, we have another practice called terraces or terracing, which I'd imagine is something that you know about there, where you mound up dirt on the contour. This is a much cheaper option than terracing, and you don't have to do all that dirt work and all that destruction out in the field. So again, disproportionate benefits. Yes, you're taking 10% of the land out, but you're seeing benefits to wildlife, benefits to water filtration, and benefits to your soil.
Okay. I guess I was thinking about what you were, these deep roots, this plant structure that's underneath the surface, and it did make me think, watching some of the great videos on the Prairie Strips website about how to establish and manage these. In some ways, those deep roots are kind of the key to the establishment and kind of outcompeting weeds in these strips. Can you walk us through a grower who wants to get a prairie strip going, kind of the basic principles of managing these strips?
Yeah, that's a great question. And agronomically, they are very different than an annual crop or an orchard or a vineyard or something like that. Here, what you want to do is, once you seed, and typically, contrary to what people might think, I really enjoy doing what's called a frost seeding, or getting the seed out on the ground. Here in the upper Midwest, it'd be sometime after November 15th. So allowing the wildflowers, which are these temperate wildflowers that need a period of cold, moist to stratify, break their dormancy, and germinate. So seeding after the crops are out. And then, we mentioned the deep roots. For the first 2 years, those seedlings are really going to be putting a lot of that energy into the roots, and really what you think of as almost growing down rather than growing up. So they're building these really deep root reserves right away. But at the end of the first year, you may have prairie plants that are only 4, 5, 6 inches tall. And it's very, very important to, give them a competitive advantage over a suite of invasive annual weeds that we have in this country. Mowing is a fantastic way to do that. So a quick rule of thumb is anytime that overall vegetation gets to about knee height, go and mow it down to ankle height. And doing that will just give the prairie seedlings the right amount of light, the right amount of nutrients, the right amount of water. Tall weeds are going to be transpiring a lot of water, taking that away from the seedlings. So they just need that for the first year. Here in the upper Midwest, probably 3 or 4 times mowing would be fantastic. And then in the second year, we like to tell people to mow once or maybe twice, but mow at about 10 inches in that second year.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, you should be okay. And if you want to get into more maintenance, kind of after spring of the third year, prescribed fire is kind of the best thing. I mean, it's the closest thing to a magic wand that you have for maintaining prairie, because it really can invigorate that prairie. And again, a lot of the introduced weeds, or especially like woody material, trees, shrubs, things like that, are not adapted to fire. So the native vegetation will really respond well to being burned.
Wait, there's a couple things I just want to catch up. So one thing that I noticed right away, oftentimes, at least here on the West Coast, when people are doing a prairie strip, oftentimes they have annuals seeded in, and you're kind of like looking for recruitment. Here, it's going to be it's primarily perennial, and you're mowing because you're not worried about seed recruitment. Your seeds are already on the ground. You want those plants to get big and vigorous, and so you're almost like they may not even go to flower. You're just pushing those roots down into the soil.
Yeah, that's correct. In the tallgrass prairie species that we use here in the Midwest, you might have a couple species of annuals, but it really, really minimal. The vast majority of things are going to be coming back from seed. So yeah, the annual thing we don't have to worry about, and we can kind of get into that a little bit more. That this is a practice that's available nationwide through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Conservation Reserve Program.
Mm-hmm.
Got introduced in the 2018 Farm Bill. I could talk about that now, or we can wait till later to talk about it.
Hold that thought for a sec. I do want to get into sort of let me just keep pressing you and picking your brain on the mechanics of this.
Okay.
And I guess the other thing is keeping. I wanted to ask grass and forbs, like the proportion. Oftentimes for the pollinator folks, we like to have lots of forbs, but we all know if you go pure forbs, it can't hold its own against weeds. And so tell us a little bit about how you've kind of come to your experience of mixing grasses and forbs.
Yeah, you're right on, Anthony. You've got it figured out. I mean, we've found the same thing here. Back probably 2012 or so, there was a really popular program called CP42, which was pollinator habitat. And that was really heavy on forbs, which was great. It was a great way to get a lot of flowers out onto the landscape. But those plantings are not nearly as resilient. They can be more open to invasion by perennial weeds like Canada thistle that can be a real nuisance. So what we try to do with the prairie strips is to get more of an even blend. You have the same number of seeds per square foot of grasses as you have of the forbs. And again, trying to just get a more even blend, not putting so few forbs that they're going to be overtaken by the grasses, but not putting so many that you have vulnerability to weeds, and hoping that this will be more resilient into the future.
So almost, would I be right? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but almost like 50% of the plants are grass, 50% are forbs.
At the seeding time. So yeah, it's what's called generally a 20-20 mix, and it's 20 seeds per square foot of grasses, 20 seeds of forbs, that kind of a thing.
Fantastic. And I guess the last thing that I just wanted to pick up before moving on to sort of how this is done and how people can, are able to put this into practice on their farms. There is the issue of woody material moving in, that you're always going to have a shrub, a bird is going to poop out and so that I guess you can't deal with the burning was the one thing, periodic burning, but I guess the other thing is to spot treat. Tell us a little bit about the kind of options you have for kind of keeping it in that prairie state.
Yep, the wood. So yes, there is going to be invasion of woody materials. That is something that needs to be managed for, and I don't have any magic solutions for it. One of the things that is neat about prairie as a just one of many conservation practices is it's beautiful and it's fun to go out there and walk around through. So we encourage people to scout as much as possible. If you have problems with woody vegetation, here, dogwoods, cottonwoods, willows, a lot of these things that are either blown around by the wind or moved around by birds can be really common. But just getting on top of that stuff sooner rather than later. If you do burn and do a prescribed fire in the springtime, you can really set that stuff back. You may not necessarily kill it, but if you can just kind of stay on top of your burning, keep on top of those things before they get to be, 8-inch diameter, it'll be a lot easier to deal with. And fire is one of those ways to do that. But I don't have any magic answer. There will take some ongoing maintenance with these things. It's people kind of pitch prairie as a sort of a no maintenance land use cover, and really it's low maintenance. You can't say that it's something that you can just kind of, whether it's in your front yard or backyard or wherever it is, you can't just throw the seed and then let nature take its course. You have to intervene.
I guess the last thing on establishment and maintenance is the actual establishment is, and I really love that idea of like a seeding at frost, that you're not going to get any germination because it's already gotten too cold, but you're able to get the stratification of the seed for native species that might need it. But in terms of site prep, I guess here it's in this setting it's real easy because the growers already create a seed bed for their crop, so they're kind of seeding into that seed bed. Is that the typical practice?
Yeah. So here we're almost exclusively going into corn and soybean stubble, following one of those two major row crops that we have here. And yeah, you nailed it. I mean, the plants and the weeds have been controlled for many years, whether that's through tillage or herbicide use or some combination of the two. So it is really, really nice to go into if you were going into something that's more aggressive. And again, whether that would be this can be applicable to small scale, large scale, whatever. If you're going into some place that has existing vegetation, and especially something that's highly competitive, like a cool season grass, whether that would be Kentucky bluegrass in your yard or smooth brome or whatever it may be, that stuff has to really be knocked back. You can't just go and throw seed into that existing cool season grass and hope for success. You need to do something. If it's small scale, you can smother it out, you can treat it with herbicide. And if it's large scale, tillage, heavy grazing, hit it with herbicide, just plan on almost an entire year of prepping existing cool season vegetation before trying to get prairie there, because the cool season stuff, it'll just come back and it'll really make it hard for you to get a prairie established.
Okay, well, thanks for all of that, and that does bring us on to the what you were leading us into in terms of not only financial ways to offset some of these costs, but also the technical support. I imagine this is not when you're doing I imagine growers in Iowa are amongst the best in the world at growing field crops, but this is kind of a different field crop, so it takes some technical assistance. What kind of support exists?
Yeah. So, again, I keep talking about how this started as a idea from a interdisciplinary group of researchers at Iowa State, but I'm really proud about the fact that this, really simple, elegant idea started in the middle of Iowa, because it is such a simple, easy idea, but it's not something that a lot of us in North America have a whole lot of experience with. It's something that there's not a lot of it left, certainly here in the upper Midwest. So there is a lot of hand holding that needs to go on, in positions like mine that are people on the ground that are actually going out and helping farmers and landowners. That's really, really useful. But one thing that was a major victory for the Prairie Strips team was that we were able to work with our legislators in Des Moines, which is the capital of Iowa, and then in Washington, D.C., to have Prairie Strips included in the 2018 Farm Bill. So this is something that now is available nationwide. It could be from Guam all the way to New York State. Not every state has adopted it yet, but it is available. The vast majority, I think we've got a little over 18,000 acres nationwide. The vast majority of that are in Iowa and Illinois, but there's some all the way down in Mississippi. There's a few in Kentucky, and then the rest is kind of a smattering around, Indiana, Minnesota, Missouri, just the states that are out here.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a huge step forward in making it easier for farmers and landowners to get this practice, because in each county all across the United States, you can go to your local U.S. Department of Agriculture Service Center and receive technical support, talk to people that know about what you're doing. And if you decide to go forward, you can work through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Conservation Reserve Program to be paid to put this in. So they'll pay for 100% of your establishment costs, and then you will receive an annual rental payment for those acres that are taken out of production, put into prairie every year for 10 years. So it's from a row crop perspective, yes, you could potentially make more money growing row crop, but as a landowner or someone that is not a farmer, if you happen to own land, the rate that is paid by the Conservation Reserve Program is very, very competitive to what you'd be getting for cash rent. And if you can target those areas that are maybe lower producing, harder to farm, less efficient, whatever it may be, then that can be even more of a no-brainer. And being able to, again, go down to usually it's here in Iowa, it's in what's called the county seat town, where you've got your county courthouse and all that stuff. You can find this local USDA service center. These are people that live in your community. They know the soil, they know the farming techniques in that area, and you could ask them about CP43 prairie strips. Again, I don't believe this is available in Oregon yet, but we've had orchard growers and vineyard producers reach out to the strips team about doing practices like that out there. So again, it doesn't have to be enrolled in a program. It doesn't have to go through the USDA. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations that would offer grants or funding. Here in Iowa, we have Trees Forever. They offer grants for this kind of thing. There's a Xerxes Society, the Pollinator group. They have grants for this kind of thing. So you can find funding and find technical support outside of the government, but the USDA is a great source for this.
Well, and I think the important thing in Oregon is, and I don't know about this program specifically, but NRCS at a state level is always interested in adopting practices that are important for their growing community. And so, if some of you are interested in this, really, expressing that to your local offices, and when they hear it, they really want to support. I mean, they're really here to serve and make sure that the ag sector has all the tools that they find the most interesting. It's a kind of two-way conversation. Well, that is fantastic. And so I guess, when you are you're looking for some of these farm bill programs, it is the first stop is going into the service center. And I suppose I'm just thinking about this example that you started with. You have a piece of property. You've kind of sat down carefully, planned it. You know where the areas are that are of low profitability. I guess that's what you would come in with a plan to the service center. I've got these areas. These are the areas that I kind of want to transition. Is that kind of how the conversation starts?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to go about it. You could go in sort of blind and just say, hey, I'm interested in this. And maybe they'd be able to come up with a design for you, or maybe they'd be able to look at your soil maps with you. But it's pretty rare here that any one person is kind of making all of those decisions, whether you have business partners, be that your parents or your siblings or, whoever is involved with the land with you. I think it'd be important to get people around the kitchen table or whatever that may be to have some of these conversations just about, hey, have you heard of this thing? Would you like to know this? Because oftentimes when I'm meeting with farmers or landowners, you maybe have an off-farm heir to the farmland that is, read an article in the New York Times or whatever it may be about prairie strips, and they're very interested, but whoever's living in the rural community farming maybe isn't as on board or just hasn't heard of it yet. So
Mhm.
it's good to get as many kind of stakeholders or members of your team involved, because like we talked about earlier, you're going to need, someone's going to have to mow this. Someone's going to have to keep the trees down. You can't just, hey,
Right.
we want to do good for pollinators. Let's throw some prairie seed on the ground and just like feel really good about it, and it is something to feel good about, but you also have to be realistic. So yeah, just kind of developing a little game plan with your team and then taking that in. And again, being able to go into that USDA office and ask for prairie strips is a lot easier than it has ever been. And again, the prairie strips are not perfect. If we could convert all the state of Iowa back to prairie, there would be a lot of benefits to that, but that's never going to happen. It's
Mhm.
just not realistic. So if we can get these small amounts back out there, that's good. But just keeping in mind, we got to keep everybody on the same page, get as good of a plan as we can get.
Well, that's a great transition to what the last question I had for you. And, I can imagine, people's vision of this. They may see a video or read the New York Times and think, oh, why doesn't everybody do it? And you've described in this interview, there is mowing, there is, you're constantly worried about invasive weeds that can then get into your crop and then, cause a whole lot of problems. There are all sorts of moving parts, and you're already running a busy farm business. And so having this new thing on top of everything, especially in the last couple of years, has been a real turbulent few years in the ag sector. And so I guess, as somebody who's in your role, how do you start that conversation about with growers who already are kind of overwhelmed with everything?
Yeah, I've been working this job for almost 10 years now, and I've been doing this same thing, just a lot of outreach. And again, I grew up on a farm. I still actively farm, so that helps in some way that I'm an insider to this, and I'm an Iowa kid, and I can speak the lingo. And but I've had some really, really good bosses at Iowa State and members of this strips team that have really helped me to mature a lot. Different mentors that I've had. One of the things is that when you go to a farm, you are not the expert. Whoever is the farmer, they are the expert. It's that is one of the things. And then another thing that I learned was to meet people where they are. If you step out of your vehicle at the farm and you start to say, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, oftentimes people are going to close their ears. Meet people where they are. Realize that yes, you may have an advanced degree or whatever, you may be the expert about prairie strips, but you are not the expert when you're on this person's farm. And trying to be just as cognizant of where people are, and again, finding opportunities to get prairie on the landscape, whether someone is interested in hunting game birds or whether someone is interested in taking pictures of skipper moths. I've got a prairie for that. You can do either one, whatever your interests are. And I love the flexibility of it. I guess that was kind of what I was trying to say earlier about the flexibility of the prairie. Yes, it's not perfect. This prairie strips, it'd be better if the whole field was in prairie, but just taking a little bit of this out there, if the farmers can actually work around it, and we can get some of the benefits of the conservation and some of the benefits of the economics, side by side or on the same acres, everybody wins. Iowa would be a better place. The United States would be a better place if we could just get some more native habitat back out onto the landscape, because it's what the wildlife respond best to. It's what cleans the water the best. It's what holds our valuable soil in place, all these things. So just kind of trying to listen as much as possible and then pitching an angle for prairie. And I think that would be very applicable out in Oregon too, depending upon who you're talking to. It's like it can really appeal to a lot of audiences.
Well, fantastic. I just can imagine what the next few months are ahead of you, talking to a lot of growers, going to a lot of meetings. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of maybe the break between the summer and the fall to talk with us. This has been a really wonderful podcast.
Absolutely. I appreciate you inviting me on. And yeah, prairiestrips.org for anybody that's interested in more information. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.